one more thing to say on this subject. But like I said, I worked with all of them, and none of it would have happened without Stan. If you remember, or maybe you do or don't, but in the late 50s and even 1960, 61, and even in the 60s when I was working at DC, which started in 65, so 66, 67, even toward the end of the 60s, Jack Kirby, they thought he was terrible.
Yes.
He couldn't get a job at DC Comics.
Everybody thought his style was archaic.
Well, and
I didn't like him at all in those days. I thought he sucked. Steve Swink came to work for me as my first manager, and he had Jack on such a pedestal. I was like, Steve, really? I mean, the guy was once good.
Well, at any rate, I mean, DC Comics wouldn't hire him in the late 50s or early 60s, and then they talked bad about him the whole time I was there. And same with Steve Ditko. These guys were considered third-string artists, okay?
Yep.
They were really considered third-string artists. They couldn't get work at most places. That's why Jack was doing a lot of work at Marvel. Steve was working at Marvel and Charlton, which paid nothing. And so what Stan did is he gave them an opportunity. He came up, he created the venue where they could shine.
Yes.
Because each of them was a brilliant creator and a brilliant storyteller. So Stan, by his creative contributions and sort of overseeing the Marvel Universe and making it a universe, he gave them the stage to play on. And boy, did they knock it out of the park.
They did.
And then they became first string pretty damn quick.
And you know, the older I got, and I was blessed to be able to tell Steve Swink this before he passed, which is that the older that I got, the more I came to realize the brilliance of Jack Kirby and the brilliance of Steve Ditko and all those guys that were in that bullpen.
Yeah.
That was lightning in a bottle.
Oh, absolutely.
But nobody gives credit to the fact that Stan, just as a case in point, was the greatest guy ever at creating what's called above the fold on comics.
Oh, yes.
He created better logos and better imagery. What above the load is where, above the fold is. It used to be that on spin racks you could only see the top half of a comic, and so Stan personally designed every Marvel Comics cover so that the area that was exposed, that was above the fold, would be dynamic and would sell that book. And when you look at the word balloons that he put on there and the imagery that he put on there, he made damn sure that, and he was a marketing genius, and he marketed himself as well. And so people now are trying to say, oh, Stan Lee should be canceled because some of what he had when he created his own imagery was a construct. Some of the stuff that he put up from the 40s and the 50s, where he said, I did this and I did that. There are all these exposés that are coming out now. It's just a bunch of horseshit, because what matters is that.
For real.
Well, not only that, without Stan, we wouldn't be here today. No. And that's something that none of us should forget about. And I just want to remind you of the time that you arranged at the 25th anniversary party for Marvel at the U.S. Grant for Stan and Jack to have finally their reunion moment. Well,
I have a picture that I got it there. Jack gave it back to me. I gave it to him. He gave it back to me, and he signed it to Jim, a good friend, and I was. We got along fine. He used to thank me for helping him all the time, because I'd go over scripts with him and stuff, and he never argued with me or anything. I'd say, well, what do you think if we make this like this, Jack? And he'd say, you do that, young man. At the end, he'd thank me for helping him. So we got along terrific. He has contentions with Marvel. Everybody knows about that. But finally, in '86, it was settled. It was all done. His artwork was being returned. It should have been more. I'm sorry I wasn't there back in the days when nobody cared about it and they gave it away. But he was getting his art back. He was going to get credit on the stuff he created. It was as good as it could be. All right. And so I saw him at San Diego. And I asked him, I said, we're having a 25th anniversary party tonight. I'd be really honored if you would come, you know. And he said, oh, well, we'll see. And his wife said, I don't think so. Look, Roz was his fiercest defender, and you know what? She wasn't wrong, because he should have been treated a hell of a lot better than he was.
Oh, Roz was totally right.
She was his fiercest defender of her husband, and I don't blame her.
Yep.
But I mean, it got bitter sometimes. That and I think that she was fighting heroically for her husband, and anyway, she didn't want to go. But I'm standing in the back of the room. And I'm standing beside Stan. He has a wine glass in his hand.
Yep.
He had a little bit of white wine. He hardly ever drank anything, but he had a glass of white wine. And I was standing next to him. We kind of stepped back into the shadows because to get out of the hullabaloo, it was, I don't know how many people were there. It looked like 1,000.
Oh, there were at least 1,000.
At least
that ballroom was
packed. And that's a big ballroom.
Yeah.
Oh, so we're hiding in the back a little bit just to get a little break. And we're talking about this and that, and Stan, of course, talks with his hands, all the time. So he says something, and he smashes the hand that with the wine glass hits a pillar.
Yep.
And the glass breaks and cuts his right hand, and it cut it bad. And he gets his handkerchief out, and he's trying to hold it, and I say, you have to go to the emergency room. At that moment, Jack walks in with Roz, right? And I said, Stan, Jack's here. And he said, oh my God. He said, should I? And I said, stay here. So I went over and got Jack, and I walked Jack and Roz over to Stan. And they talked. It was like, all right, everything's behind us, and they were friends again. Jack and Roz said they should come down to visit sometime. And Stan said, oh, and you guys should come up, and be with John and I, and so they were getting to be almost friends again. And Stan made the mistake of saying, he said, look, Jack, I don't care about owning it. You can own everything. He said, I don't care about the credits. I don't care about anything. But it'd be fun to work together one more time. And Roz couldn't take that. She said something like bite your tongue or something, and dragged Jack away. And that was the end of that. Then Stan had to go to the emergency room.
Well, so did my employee who was with us then.
He stepped on the glass.
Yeah, because she was dancing barefoot, and she stepped on the glass and ended up having to fly home to Denver. I had to pay for an emergency ticket. So that was a crazy party.
It was a crazy
but seeing the two of them get back together again, because I was standing right next to you during a lot of that.
Yeah, you were I don't know, really in earshot. You were not standing right next to me, but right over there somewhere.
Yep. And that was such an auspicious moment, and I remember that because now when people try to paint it that the two of them became bitter enemies, that's craziness. You're right about Roz. Roz was
she was a fierce defender, and I'm not saying they were all buddies all the time. I mean,
no.
Jack said some bad things about Stan here and there.
Yeah.
Stan never, I don't think, publicly denigrated Jack, but he was a couple times was really, it hurt him, and he would talk to me about it like how can this be? People say, oh, Stan took credit for stuff. Generally speaking, he didn't. I mean, if you read what he wrote, he generally gave out credit like candy. And the places that people get outraged about usually are when some reporter says Stan Lee, the creator of Captain America, on the headline.
Oh yeah, that's the push button.
Stan didn't do it, and he never said he did. But I remember the same thing happened with Denny O'Neil. He was doing some lectures up in the Rockland County area where I live, and the lectures were about writing Batman, especially, and other things. And so there's a big article in the Journal News, headline, "The creator of Batman, Dennis J. O'Neil." He never said that.
No.
But the reporter inferred it or something.
Yeah.
And so that happens sometimes, and that kind of sucks.
Well, the other thing was, and this is just the truth, is that money factored into a lot of it, because Stan was pretty canny. He invested his money, and he also was able to position himself within the various machinations that occurred so that he came out okay on the money end, whereas guys like Jack didn't get any sugar at the end.
No, and I think that's one of the big things is that Stan, of course, was inside. He was the editor, and he was on staff. And because it was all succeeding, then he was able to get better and better deals for himself.
Yeah.
Right. And that's one thing you said. You said faults. Here's the fault.
Yeah.
I think he could have stood up more for Kirby and Ditko and the rest.
Oh, yeah.
And he didn't. And I think it was because he didn't want to rock the boat too much and get in trouble with Galton and the board and everybody. You know?
Yeah, but he got a great deal for himself, because when
Yes,
Martin sold and Shelley took over, Stan was able to get himself a strong deal at that point.
There's a space in between there, but Shelley did come in soon. But in '68, Martin Goodman sold
Perfect
Marvel
Film and Chemical.
to Perfect Chemical Company, which
Right.
changed its name to Cadence Industries.
Right.
And they also bought a bunch of other little companies, because conglomerates were all the rage in those days, like Litton Industries.
Oh, yeah.
For example.
Wang and all those guys.
Yeah, all those guys.
Yeah.
So they tried to build this little conglomerate, but it was stupid. Most of the companies there were useless, and it was losing money, and so forth. And of course, Martin Goodman, when he sold it, had a contract that said he had to remain for several years, and Stan's. In other words, nothing really changed at the Marvel office, except that somebody else owned it now. You know, so this failing conglomerate. They needed rescued. I mean, it was a public company, and it was tanking. The corporation was tanking, not just Marvel. Marvel wasn't doing great, but the corporation was tanking.
Doing great. No.
Vitamin Quota Shops, Perfect Pen and Pencil, or U.S. Pen and Pencil, Perfect Subscription Company, a chain of theaters in Boston, 12 theaters in Boston.
There was one in Colorado Springs.
And they had they owned land in Culver City.
Culver City, yeah, the studio, the old studio.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And you know, it's like this hodgepodge of stuff. And the only good thing they had that was good was Curtis Circulation.
You know, I have all the SEC filings, and I have to find them, because one of my good friends over in France is trying to do a history of Martin Goodman and what he did, and it ties in with this. But Curtis Circulation was originally owned by the Saturday Evening Post.
Yes.
Well, one day, it was no longer owned by the Saturday Evening Post, and it was owned by Cadence, Perfect Film and Chemical, and on. You know, when I pulled the SEC documents, all the filings, no money changed hands. I was always really curious about what the hell went down with that.
Well, companies like that are generally sold for receivables. It's a service company.
Yeah.
Okay. And I don't know what their transaction was with their one parent to go to the next, but it's conceivable that it would have happened without a lot of money, or it would have happened with some exchange that didn't involve paying, you know, the receivables. They get to keep.
I gotta find those documents.
You gotta find them. The Library for Business on Madison Avenue in New York is good.
Okay.
All right.
Well,
I went there. I read all those documents, by the way.
Yeah.
But the thing is, because I was going to write a book called Supervillains, with the S was going to be a dollar sign. But at any rate,
that would be a long book.
Yeah, I might do it someday. But anyway, so this corporation is failing, and they found this guy Sheldon Feinberg, and he was famous for rescuing corporations like that. And so they got him in. They gave him an incredible deal. He was a super fat cat, and the first thing he had to do was get money to keep them alive till he could fix it. And the only bank that in the country that would loan him the money, give him a line of credit, was the Bank of Boston.
Okay.
When I first started working in Marvel, I used to wonder why my checks were drawn on the Bank of Boston.
Yeah.
Because they were the only people who would support Cadence Industries. And anyway, he brought in some guys just out of law school. They were his hatchet men. They would go into these little companies and clean them up, dress them up the best they could, fire a lot of people, and strip them down and make them saleable. And of course, you know better than I do, Chuck, there's all these kinds of ways to make it look like the revenues are better.
Yes.
And yeah, all right. Well, let's not get into accounting, but you know what I mean. And so they were successful, and they sell these little companies off, right? All right. So now this is the era where it's coming to the end of Martin Goodman's employment with Marvel.
Right.
And he went to the board of directors at Cadence. And he wanted to cut a deal where his son would come in as the new president of the company.
Sure.
And so the thing is, here's Stan, and like Jack and like Steve, felt like, I have built all this, you know. and wait a minute, you mean I just get my next paycheck and Chip Goodman is going to be my boss?
Yeah.
You know, he didn't like that. He actually went to DC and negotiated a deal with DC. And actually had started working on it. He was going to rename it Super Comics.
Oh my God.
Because it was Detective Comics, what's that? That's stupid. And he had plans for the characters and stuff like that. And I don't know whether he actually had officially quit at Marvel yet, but he was already working on it at DC. He told me a bunch of the stuff he was planning. Well, then they quickly backed out of the Chip Goodman deal. They reneged on that. And when Martin left, in fact, they made Stan president of the company. He still was, Roy became the editor then, and he called himself editor-in-chief. I don't know if he just made that up or they told him to call himself that, but whatever. But Stan was still involved, and Roy didn't have the free hand that I had. And so that went along for a little while, 2.5 years with Roy.
And in the meantime, Chip Goodman founded Atlas Seaboard Comics, and cratered that in 4 issues.
Yeah, that probably happened in 76, 75, 76.
75, yeah.
So anyway, so Stan was the president for basically a little while. He hated it. He wasn't a business guy. He didn't care about it. And so finally, he made a deal with them that he would be called the publisher. And then they brought in this Al Landau guy to be the president. So Stan was the publisher, but he didn't, at that point, Roy had gone, and then Len Wein had come in as editor-in-chief. At that point, Stan really stopped being involved with the comics. Mm-hmm. Of course, he's still Stan Lee, and everybody still treated him as if he was in charge. Mm-hmm. But he really was doing more and more media work and less comics. And by a couple years later, he wasn't involved at all. He wasn't even on the organizational chart. He was his own organizational chart. He was over there somewhere.
Yeah. Well, he moved to the West Coast around that time too.
Well, he moved. I became editor-in-chief in '78. He moved out there like '81, maybe 80. Yeah, I think like '81. Right around there. And we had really turned it around. And like I said, I didn't work for him. He wasn't my boss. The president was my boss. On the other hand, his office is 30 feet from mine.
Right.
And if I have a question, you think I'm going to go ask him? Of course I'm going to go ask him.
Hell yeah.
And so collegially, he was helping me every
Well,
day.
there's that issue of Marble Age where he's standing on top of a soapbox, trying to be as tall as you are and failing miserably.
Yeah.
But it was a funny cover, and I really liked it. But I thought it spoke volumes about how he really felt that you were carrying the load for him now.
Yes, and we were such good friends. I worked on, one of my first things at Marvel was I was editor. He needed somebody to help him write the Spider-Man strip. He was older enough at that point, he didn't want to work that hard, so he wanted to have someone else write the story, the plot. Mm-hmm. And then John Romita would draw it, and he would write the dialogue, and that was the way it worked. The first person, I guess he asked Archie Goodwin, who's your best writer? And Archie gave a good answer. It's also politically correct, because he was an ex-editor-in-chief. He said Len Wein. And so Len did it a little while, and Stan didn't like what he did. And so he fired him, not from the company, from the strip. Then he needed somebody, and everybody else nobody would take it, because they were afraid of being embarrassed, being fired by Stan.
Yeah.
And he finally asked me, and I said, yeah, I'll do it. And so I started doing it, and what I would do is I'd do little layouts for the strip, and write what the story was, panel by panel, and do a little layout for each panel. And he loved it, because then he could write the dialogue right from my layouts.
Yeah.
Give it all to John at once.
Yeah.
You know, because the writer writes and the artist does everything else. You know, lettering and all, like he gets all that stuff done.
Yeah.
So we got to know each other a little bit. I mean, he actually a couple times said things like, "You seem to know what you're doing." I said, "You're damn straight I do." And so we got to work together. You know, and P.S. I learned a lot from that guy. I mean, I learned things every day from him. And he was, that's why I say, don't sell him short. This guy's a genius. He was incredible.
So much of a genius. And in the time that I worked with him, first of all, he saved my ass a couple of times by coming out and doing signings gratis for me, once here in Denver, once in Garden Grove. And I watched him in Garden Grove. He had a dinner date with Joni that he had to go to. And we had 2,000 people lined up. And he said, I'm going to sign them all. He said, Chuck, you're in charge. You make them move. He said, keep them moving, and I will sign autographs for every single person in that line.
Yeah, he was
and this was when he was already a multimillionaire, and he didn't have to do anything for anybody. No. He drove himself down from Beverly Hills down to Garden Grove, and it took him about 90 minutes, but he signed for 2,000 people. And I just kept having to say to people, mind you, try to go as quick as you can. And everybody loved that signing, and it worked so well. But every time that I met Stan, I learned more about the comics industry, and I learned more about how to be a good person. And so to see and hear and read people trashing him now just irritates the crap out of me.
And it's so wrong. It is wrong. I mean, like I said, I worked with all three guys. I worked with Jack and had a great relationship with him. I worked with Steve and had a great relationship with him. And nobody has more respect for either of those gentlemen than I do. Yeah. But you don't have to take anything away from Stan to give Jack and Steve credit for the enormous contributions.
Well, I ended up, being able to, Jack and Roz would wait for me at our booth in San Diego. If I was off doing some deal somewhere, they would wait half an hour in the booth just to say hi to me. And for the longest time, I really tried to avoid Jack's artwork because I had this thing in my head about, it's all archaic and so on. And then one day I had this epiphany. I started looking at some of his work, and it was just like, oh my God, this guy's a genius, and I'm blessed to be able to just hang out with him.
I think that if you just look at a drawing, you might say, well, that looks old-fashioned or something.
Yeah.
But if you look at the storytelling, I give a storytelling lecture. I use one of Jack's books as slides of the pages.
Yeah.
And I explain what he's trying to do here, what his approach is, what he's thinking. And if people say, well, how do you know what he was thinking? He told me for 2.5 years what he was thinking.
Yeah.
Because after we get done going over the books, if I had time, I'd say, do you mind if I ask you some questions? And he'd say, oh, yeah, you do that, young man. And he was sharp as a tack when he was talking about the craft. And I'd say, why did you pick this angle? Or where were you going with this? Or what made you think of this? Or
nothing was happenstance. It was all forethought.
And he could tell you in great detail why he picked that angle. And he could tell you in great detail how he came up with that idea. And he did. And what an amazing guy. I mean,
yeah, well, that's where I kind of had to eat humble pie, because, here I was not appreciating his genius, and then having this epiphany and realizing that the guy that I'd been hanging out with because I liked him as a person was also this crazy talented guy.
Absolutely, yeah. And anyway,
all right, we got to stop. We've been going on forever and a day, and this video is going to be something that people are going to try and watch after dinner.
You're going to edit this down to 15 minutes, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, good luck with that. Yeah, but I want to thank you, and maybe we can do another one of these at some point in the future. If you guys are wondering, we're doing this in my gallery because it's really well lit in here and it's easier. But this is the Pueblo pottery that I collect, so that I don't collect comic books, because I collect comic books, okay, but I collect the ones that nobody used to want. Like I collect religious comics and underground comics and them furrin comics, and none of those were categories that anybody liked in the past. Now they do. But I got into collecting Pueblo pottery 25 years ago, and my collection is now second to the Smithsonian. So we got this nice little gallery here to do this, and that's my dog Nikki in the background, who is schnoozing. But anyway, we wanted to do this conversation because this is what Jim and I do when we go and have lunch together, when I visit him in Nyack, on those blessed moments, and it just makes my damn day. Because reminiscing about these early events in comics history, like I said at the very beginning of this, Jim and I were there, and we did not always have the same views. We were looking at it from different angles. but our memories coincide so well that I thought that this would be a great little, hopefully, series of interviews that we'll be doing over a period of time. So if you like them, please like our little video, and please read comics and try to do something good today. More than anything else, that's why we were born, that's why we exist, is to try and do some good in this world. So this is Chuck Rozanski, Jim Shooter. Thank you ever so much for watching.
Thank you.